What I shall call, as a shorthand, the modernist period is well known to be dominated by numerous conceptions of time. So many indeed that it is hard to know how to set priorities when cataloguing them. To begin with, there is the new dominance of clock time and of an absolutized world time based on the Greenwich Meridian, which was documented by Stephen Kern in his classic book, The Culture of Time and Space. The ranks of high modernists are heavily influenced by Henri Bergson's conception of durée or duration, as opposed to objectified mathematical time, as outlined in his essay Sur les données immédiates de la conscience, published in English as Time and Free Will in 1910. Proust's exploration of memory finds its analogue in Joyce's Ulysses and strongly influences Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway, which combines Proustian memory with Joyce's mapping of the day by the hour in order to thematize the contrast between objective and subjective time, the supposed contrast. The dominance of the theme of lived time among numerous Anglophone modernists drove Wyndham Lewis to such distraction that he launched an attack on what he called the time cult in Time and Western Man, lambasting Joyce, Pound and Stein in literature, Bergson and Whitehead in philosophy, and Oswald Spengler in the field of the theory of history, and discerning a kind of conspiracy against the public, who are destined to be more open to be manipulated by the governing forces of mass society if they are persuaded that they live in an entirely subjectivized flux. Lewis launched his attack in the guise of an outsider, adopting the stance of the enemy of the status quo, although in fact his position in British culture was relatively assured, as he had the backing of Eliot and was able to publish with Chatto and Windus. Despite his impressive credentials as an innovative modernist author, those scholars who focus in their work and in their preferred objects of study on time and memory have sometimes seemed to endorse the modernist celebration of subjectivity and treated Lewis as an aberration and an outsider, where they have acknowledged his work at all. The reason for this lies no doubt in his abrasiveness, his satirical tone, perhaps his coldness, and probably above all in his declared support for Hitler, which led Auden in the 1930s to label him the lonely old volcano of the right. Lewis, although certainly eccentric, offers a useful reminder that the literary focus on subjective time is not only, and not so much even, a private concern of the authors concerned with the aesthetic and the biographical, who can be represented as formal innovators or as the discoverers of previously unknown dimensions of interiority. Instead, time is a matter of intense public contestation across various domains, and above all is a matter of public ideology, of the structure of common lived experience, whether in the organisation of work or the celebration of fashion, and perhaps above all, in the mapping of changes in the post-war world in terms of the inevitability of progress or change. Time and Western Man, published in 1927, has slowly become familiar outside the field of Lewis specialists and has even become a classic text among modernist scholars. But it is worth just dwelling on it for a moment to remind ourselves how Lewis maps this field. Lewis's first paragraph outlines the scope of his work. Quotation. This essay is a comprehensive study of time, notions which have now, in one form or another, gained an undisputed ascendancy in the intellectual world. The time mind, as I have called it, is first considered here in its more concrete manifestations as we find it notably in works of fiction, poetry or painting. And he goes on, then the significance of all that type of belief and feeling which can conveniently be marshalled under the concept of time is examined in detail. How the timelessness of Einsteinian physics and the time-obsessed flux of Bergson merge in each other, and how they have conspired to produce, upon the innocent plane of popularization, a sort of mystical time cult is shown. End quotation. The title of Lewis's book, Time and Western Man, ties this campaign against the time cult, as he calls it, to the notion of a defense of the West. For Lewis, the notion of the West is, in any case, incoherent. And it is worth examining in a little detail the passage in which he deals with this project and its roots in his attempt to create even the imaginary notion of a platform from which revolutionary capitalism and communism could be critiqued. He writes, "The significance of the concept time in contemporary philosophy and the results of its application to all the complex of life and artistic expression around us is the main subject of this essay. But in the title, Time and Western Man," he goes on, "another notion is introduced, namely Western man. The time doctrine may have a particularly unfortunate effect on specifically Western civilization," he continues, "though of course it might equally well be found to have a particularly unfortunate effect upon the remnants of the immemorial civilizations of the East. But what I think can be shown is that the time doctrine is not emotionally and psychologically essentially Western." And he continues, this is all Lewis, "and so the Western scientific man cannot really be held responsible for it. But on the other hand, it could hardly have seen the light in the native atmosphere of the Indian intelligence, for instance. Via Bergson, it has reached philosophically our distressed contemporary Western arena, contributing beyond doubt to the ever-deepening confusion of mind." I was going to say end quote, but there's a bit more. "Western man," he says, "as such, is of course the completest myth. The only question is whether we should not erect that myth into a reality, define it more, and whether, in short, some such generalization would not serve our purposes better than the multiplicity of myths that swarm in our drifting chaos." End of long quotation. The phrasing here may seem a little odd, but it is worth pausing over. The governing notion is that of the West, and this West is defined against an implicit East. At this historical juncture, for Lewis as for his close associate T.S. Eliot, it is Soviet Russia which constitutes the strange intrusion of the Asiatic into the European. The strange phrasing in this passage reflects an inconsistency in Lewis's modelling of his object. In opposing East and West, Lewis might easily have fallen back on that philosophical distinction found in Hegel's lectures on the philosophy of history between the historically conscious European moving towards freedom and the historically arrested East, which is mired in unfreedom and despotism. This philosophical position was reflected, albeit indirectly and in diluted form, in the characteristic observation of British administrators in India and elsewhere that the Oriental operated according to a different notion of time. Lewis does not adopt this model because the very form which the incursion of the Asiatic into Europe has adopted, that of the Russian Revolution, appears to be the embodiment not of a presumed Asiatic stasis, but rather of its opposite, the realization of a state of absolute change, what Lewis terms, in a misprision of Trotsky, permanent revolution. Lewis does not, therefore, attribute what he takes to be the culturally enfeebling doctrine of time to the East, and, despite his own evocation of Western man, does not subscribe to the notion advanced by Valéry and by Eliot of a defence of the European mind, although his phrasing about the confusion of mind suggests that he is aware of their claims. Western man, Lewis states, is the completest myth, and yet in some way he says that myth must be erected into a reality. European civilization must be defended against the effects of the time doctrine, although the immemorial civilizations of the East may turn out to be as much its victims as the West. We're looking to Lewis here, Lewis not in the grip of a naive Orientalism, I'm saying. We are looking to Lewis here not in order to assess the validity or otherwise of his claims, or to create a thorough intellectual history of the movement of his thought, but just in order to note that he found it possible to link the different public discourses on time and begin to discern connections between them in what he believes is an ideology spanning science, philosophy, the fine arts, popular culture, and journalism. Above all, his technique has something of the quality of what would later become known as Marx's ideology critique. That is, his discourse is a speculative one. It does not intend great faithfulness to its individual objects of intellectual study, nor does it attempt to discern patterns of influence according to a classic scholarly model. But it freely makes connections between the objects it finds circulating in the public sphere in order to create a larger speculative object, namely the field of ideology and its assumed effects. Lewis is one of those writers whose principal objects are not always and immediately brought into full view. This is in part because of a desire to insinuate his thinking with his audience without uncovering all of his goals, and in part due to an ambivalence which, as we've seen in the discourse about Western man, which arises not so much in the form of a contradiction within his thought, though it is that, but more as something unassimilable by or not easily reducible to thought. It can easily be discerned that Lewis's object is not so much time as revolution. For our purposes, his discussion of revolution in Time and Western Man, which picks up from his earlier political book, The Art of Being Ruled, 1926, gives not so much the model according to which the various manifestations of the discourse about time should be assigned, but the confirmation that the time discourses should at least be set in relation to one another and should be mapped in particular onto the major impact of the Russian Revolution, which, in the wake of the Great War, had confirmed that Europe was indeed on the brink of massive change. So Lewis does not give us the key to thinking about revolution and time, but he gives us the indication that we should make the connection between the public discourses of revolution and of time. In general, it is not the system of communism against which Lewis's attacks are launched. In some quarters, most certainly, the Russian Revolution had been discerned as a political threat, a model for domestic revolutions and a geopolitical threat to the British Empire. This threat had been met by the intervention of 30 countries in what is perhaps misleadingly termed the Russian Civil War, much as the crowns of Europe had allied against the French Revolution. Lewis's target is not directly the Red Menace, since his perception is that capitalist development in any case tends in the direction of communism, and an implicit acceptance of the broad Marxist argument. Rather, what Lewis focuses on is a displaced object, the revolutionary temperament, which he finds to be widespread. Caught, in effect, between capitalism and communism, Lewis maps a kind of third way as an apolitical intellectual, a third way which would eventually lead him to Hitler. As he expresses it in Time and Western Man, I believe that I am that strange animal, the individual without any politics at all. You will find neither the politics of communism nor those of the militant right here. The revolutionary temperament, he argues, is found on both left and right. He says, today, everybody, without exception, is a revolutionary. Some know they are, and some do not. That is the only difference. Some actually believe that they are Tories, for instance, conservatives. They really imagine that. As it is in nobody's interest to unseal their eyes and let them know themselves for the humdrum, conservative little revolutionaries they are, they remain undisturbed in that belief, end quote. Lewis indeed cites Marx and claims that, quote, revolution is first a technical process. Only after that is it a political creed or series of creeds. He goes on, the obsession of a mechanical betterment, proceeding without ceasing, is natural to industrial man. The progress of the engineer, the rapid changes and improvements of the technique of industry make it natural for him to regard everything in terms of change and improvement, and to think that he can apply to himself or to other men the methods proper to machinery, end quote. Blending his misreading of Marx with Nietzsche, Lewis goes on, quote, will to change, induced by the rapid evolution of technique, is then what we call revolution and accept as a political dogma, end quote. Anticipating what is perhaps the only frequent, this is for you by the way, Ben. Anticipating what is perhaps the only frequently quoted line of Charles Olson from his poem The Kingfishers, what does not change is the will to change, and the connection there is the philosopher Alfred North Whitehead, I think. Lewis effects a shift from Marx, who actually did believe in the agency of the proletariat as the collective subject of history, to Schopenhauer, finding the blind and unchanging will, here as will to change, underlying the activities not only of the common man, but even that of the scientists, who, he argues, are the true agents of change, the revolutionaries of whatever strike, only the passive, if excitable, followers of technology. We can turn for an example of how this general culture critique of time philosophy begins to interdict high modernist practice by looking at Lewis's critique of Ezra Pound in the first section of Time and Western Man, called The Revolutionary Simpleton. About the figure of the revolutionary simpleton, Lewis writes, aside from the hack or small professional of a revolution, there is, and one of his habitats is the art world, the revolutionary simpleton. He is not the enthusiast of the will to change at its source, but only of its surface effects on the plane of vulgarization, end quote. Lewis here points to what he sees as a popularization, even at the high cultural level, of the celebration of change, and he distinguishes between those in possession of the philosophy of change, whether of Bergson or of Marx is left open, and those enthusiasts who are simply blind to the motor of their own enthusiasm. Almost all Tories are simpletons, notes Lewis, and he goes on, but the revolutionary simpleton too is a well-marked figure. His characteristic gesture is the opposite to that of the Tory simpleton. He opens all doors, as it were, whether there is anything inside or not. He exclaims, he points excitedly to what he believes to be herds of wild horses that are constantly pouring out of the doors flung dramatically open by him. We look where he points, and occasionally observe a moke or an old hack crawling forth. So he serves, at least, to advertise our terrestrial emptiness. This personage is, in one word, a romantic. He is sick for things he has never experienced. End quote. Lewis does state that no example of the simpleton can be found or presented. He is an everyman. But this is the grouping to which he assimilates his one-time friend Ezra Pound. What we should not miss behind Lewis's characteristical satirical tone is the Nietzschean intention to provide, if not quite a genealogy, at least a speculative psychology of the modern, intended to position the embracing of change as no more than a vulgar love of novelty and as a crowd behaviour. When he turns to Pound, and I apologise, you need to know a little bit about Pound to follow this, I think, perhaps. When he turns to Pound, though, Lewis already struggles to resist his own love of novelty in the arts, and instead famously condemns Pound for his passéism. In recent years, out of contact with Pound, Lewis had discovered that Pound was interested in music and associated himself with the musician Georges Antar. Without, I think, consulting Pound's essay on Antar, Lewis positions Pound as a parasitical hanger-on in the manner of the revolutionary simpleton. He says, the Blast situation, the situation of his journal, Blast, in which Pound had participated, the Blast situation, on a meaner scale, repeats itself. Pound is there with a few gentle Provençal airs, full of a delicate scholarship and sense of the past, the organiser of a musical disturbance. The real business is done by a young musician of a fiery accomplishment and infectious faith in the great future of jazz. Not only a typical Pound situation is thus set up, but as I see it, a typical revolutionary situation of the bad type, end quote. And Lewis notes that Antal indeed seems to be doing something new and interesting, but he questions the form of Pound's advocacy. He says, it is disturbance that Pound requires. That is the form his parasitism takes. He is never happy if not sniffing the dust and glitter of action kicked up by other more natively active men. It is the type of man that Pound is, or partly is, and the method that he advocates and practices that sooner or later has to be repudiated by the artist. And in a famously entertaining and harsh paragraph, Lewis continues, Pound is, I believe, only pretending to be alive for form's sake. His effective work seems finished. The particular stimulation Pound requires for what he does all comes from without. He is terribly dependent upon people and atmosphere. At all events, there is Pound, glad to be in the neighbourhood of a big drum, making music, end quote. There's more in this vein, but I'll just focus on the claims Lewis makes as he seems to get more personal in his thoughts on Pound, who of course at one time he'd known well. Although Lewis pretends to take the fetish for the new as the object of his critique, he does actually stick fairly closely to a now traditional formalist model of modernism, accusing Pound of a lack of innovation, but going further, labelling him a time trotter for his love of the past greats to whom he gave renewed voice in his numerous translations. And Lewis saves his most carefully composed remarks with Pound's attitude towards and suitability for the present. He says, Ezra is a crowd, a little crowd. People are seen by him only as types. There's nothing that he intuits well, certainly never originally. Yet when he can get into the skin of somebody else, of power and renown in his translations, Propertius or Arnaud Daniel, he becomes a lynx or a lion on the spot. And again, when he writes in person as Pound, Lewis says his phrases are invariably stagey and false as well as insignificant. He says there's almost nowhere in the past he has not visited, but where the present is concerned is a different matter. He is extremely untrustworthy where that is concerned. When he tries to be up to date, it is a very uncomfortable business. And because he is conventional and so accepts counterfeit readily where no standard has been established, he is a danger as far as he exerts any contemporary influence. He should not be taken seriously as a living being at all. His field is purely that of the dead. Now, a proper exposition of this passage would be complicated. It would have to deal with the role played by deadness in Lewis's thought, as deadness is often presented as the nihilistic reality which vitalism denies, and as such as a term lies at the centre of the nihilism, which we saw a little earlier when Lewis alluded to the revolutionary simpleton's accidental exposure of our terrestrial emptiness. Not there an idle phrase, but a brief evocation of the denial of death, which Lewis in some moments finds at the centre of Romanticism. And here we conclude with a shift away from Lewis's time mind and his adumbration of revolution as will to change. Lewis's discourse about Pound indicates ways in which the present or the modern, the ability to be current in a way that is not blind reflex, is itself a troubled knot in modernism, so much so that Lewis's own models seem to incorporate contradictory vocabularies which it seems they had been framed to suppress. Here, the implicit endorsement of vitalism in the condemnation of Pound's association with the dead. This is no more than a sketch, and the broader context of the Russian Revolution remains latent, always implicitly acknowledged, infrequently directly addressed. What Lewis shows us, since we cannot embrace the specific contours of all his ideas in 1926 and 1927 and his much later fellow travelling with Nazism, is an indication as to how discourses about time and practices of time across a broad range of disciplines and activities can be read as fields of interference, with the proviso that the events which can be said to govern them must always be discerned as their ghostly real. Thank you. I think I had a bit of time.